Good day, everybody. It is Calxiyn here, and if you guys enjoyed this video, remember to subscribe for more RWBY videos, and this video is brought to you by my patrons and my YouTube membership members, so thanks to them very much. Today, we are talking about the most heartbreaking and also the most tragic and intense story that is in the RWBY fairy tale book, which is The Infinite Man. We can presume that this is a true life of Ozpin that he did lead, and honestly, like, the whole story just changes the way I think about Ozpin. Like, this story, like, makes me so, like, it makes me so mad, but it also makes me so upset too. And this story, I think it's absolutely like the best in the entire collection. It absolutely gutted me. Like, I just feel stabbed by this story every time I read it. This fairy tale is also recorded by Ozpin, and so again, this leads me to believe that this was one of Ozpin's lives. And in terms of who recorded what, there are a few fairy tales like with anonymous sources, and that's The Man Who Stared at the Sun, The Indecisive King, and The Girl in the Tower. And I believe that these are all hints. Like, I think that an anonymous source is supposed to signal to the audience somehow that this is one of the real stories. Because we know Girl in the Tower happened. The Indecisive King, it's a little like we aren't entirely sure, but if you watch my video on that, I am pretty convinced that the Indecisive King is the King of Vale, and I sort of talk about why in that video. And obviously The Man That Stared at the Sun, that probably didn't happen, but, you know, I feel like he just stuck an anonymous on that one so it wasn't too obvious. You know what I mean? As sort of like, it's almost like a secret code. You throw in like a one that's like obviously not it to sort of signal to the audience, if that makes sense. Like, okay, obviously The Man Who Stared at the Sun isn't right, but could these other stories be right? And that this one is like actually like produced by Ozpin, if that makes sense. And I feel like that Ozpin wouldn't be able to put his names on the other one, or it would almost be like too obvious. And I feel like it's also ironic, like he put his name on this story out of all of them, even though it's sort of implied he probably recorded The Girl in the Tower because he knew that it happened. He probably recorded The Indecisive King because that was another one of his lives, but he puts his name on The Infinite Man as almost another clue that like that he is the Infinite Man and all that stuff. And like people within Ozpin's circle would have known that because like Crow even knows that Ozpin reincarnates. Like, I'm not sure exactly where in the timeline it would go, but I think that this could be like before the Inventor life, but obviously like after the Hermit, after he decided to, you know, go back into the world and like continue his journey and what the God of Light told him to do, right? And so this could be like one of the first ones, this could be like one of many, this could be in between the Inventor life and the Inquisitor life, like we aren't really sure, but I definitely think that it is at least after the Hermit because this would be when he is re-entering the world. And he does say like this attempt is working more than in his previous lives, so it is possible that there were lives before the Inventor, and this, like, the Inventor could have been one of the ones previous and all that sort of stuff. So there's a lot of things to think about, right? But I actually think that it must be before the Inventor life because he learned to live with people instead of just body snatching them. And in this story, he still is kind of body snatching multiple times, but in the Inventor life, like, the Inventor has a family and children, and, like, Ozpin just sort of lets that be. You know, he doesn't take this man, like, and make him leave his family and stuff like that. So keeping that in mind, I would actually think that this is one of the lives that goes before the Inventor. That, again, this is after Ozpin, like, gets over himself and stops moping, but it's one of the ones that happens before he learns to, like, live with the people he body snatches and all that stuff. Because he does still body snatch in this story a couple times. He just, like, takes these men out of their lives and, like, starts walking around Remnant and all that sort of stuff. And so, yeah, that is that on that. I do think that this could be, like, pre-Inventor, after Hermit. That is basically what I'm saying without rambling too much. Now, a refrain throughout this story is, I am only a man and not even a very good one, right? And refrains like that are very common in fairy tales. It helps, you know, people remember, because if we think of fairy tales as stories that were once told orally, you know, like, I'll huff, I'll puff, I'll blow your house down, like, that's a memorable line. They help make fairy tales easier to remember for the people that had to pass them down orally and keep the core parts of the story intact. Like, you'll always remember what the wolf does to each house if you have something like that rhymes, like, I'll huff and I'll puff and I'll blow the house down. For this one, it's like, you know, I'm only a man and not even a very good one, in the times that that is repeated throughout the story. Ozpin's walking by and there's a grim attack at this village, and instead of sort of standing around, he goes to fight. And again, this is something that makes me think that this is after the Hermit, that Ozpin is now like, okay, well, I'm done staying in solitude, I'm gonna go out and help people. Like, a very naive idea, but also a very, like, sort of an opposite of the Hermit. Instead of, you know, staying alone in solitude, he is now recklessly, in some ways, jumping into action, right? And he fights until he's unconscious and kills every last Grimm, and people nurse him back to health. health, right? And so again, he's not, you know, worried about this body dying. He's just sort of, you know, fighting until he's unconscious because he knows he'll reincarnate. So who cares about this random fuck that I'm body snatched? Like, you know what I'm saying? And I'm like, oh, Ozpin, oh dear. Like, this is definitely before he learned to live with the people that he body snatched, you know? This is before the inventor, like, for sure. Like, I'm pretty sure anyway. People nurse him back to health, ask how he did that. Like, how did you fight against all those Grimm, bro? And he's just like, yeah, I've been at this a very long time, which again, like, is sort of, you know, an irony sort of thing, like a haha, a good chuckle for the audience, because we know he's literally been at this for a very long time. He's immortal, he reincarnates. And yeah, so Ozpin doesn't really seem to care about his host, because he admits he would likely have died if not for the people in the town saving him. And like, he didn't bank on that. Like, they just sort of happened to say, like, he really does not give a fuck. You know, he doesn't care about the poor guy that Ozpin stabbed. Like, what if that guy doesn't want to die, you know, and all that sort of stuff. But he's like, yeah, you guys, I would have died if you didn't heal me. And I'm just like, okay, so you willingly put your body, like, in a position where you would have died and all that stuff. He's not really valuing the people he's taking control of at this point. But anyway, Ozpin says that he helped them because he was here to help when no one else could. And then he's like, why did you take care of me? And the people basically say the same thing. Like, oh, well, you needed our help and, you know, we were here, right? And so it's like, he says that the circle's complete because like he went to go help them in their time of need, they in return helped him in his time of need. That's basically how it is. Now, in this story, we have a girl, and this girl is very similar to the boy in The Warrior in the Woods. I don't think that this girl ever feels anything romantic for Ozpin, though there is some blushing going on. It's not explicitly said that she's in love with him, like the boy in that story says that he's in love with the silver-eyed warrior, but I do think that we have a similar sort of puberty metaphor go on here, because every time that the veil is sort of pulled back and Ozpin reveals more to her, we see her grow up, right? And so I feel like that that's probably, you know, sort of the same thing as the warrior in the woods. Each time that the boy goes to see the silver-eyed warrior, he grows up a little bit more, and that's the same thing that is happening with this girl in this story. I already talked about this when it comes to encounters with the supernatural. You have sort of like abandoning your childhood and becoming an adult, like Little Red Riding Hood, right? Her, you know, encounter with the wolf that has sexual undertones and all that stuff, right? And then she grows up into an adult, and now she knows, like, better for next time. Like, that's sort of one of the versions of the Little Red Riding Hood story, but all the stories have a, you know, a wolf with, like, questionable sexual undertones and all that sort of stuff. And so, you know, when the veil is sort of pulled aside and children see the truth of the world in these stories, they become adults, like in the Little Red Riding Hood, like in Jack and the Beanstalk. And the same thing happens with the warrior in the woods. Like, every time he visits a silver-eyed warrior, the veil is sort of pulled back and we see, like, how the world truly is. And that is the same thing that happens with the girl here. The girl sees the reality of the Grimm and what Ozpin is able to do, and that's like one veil, and then she grows older. And so there's not like any like explicit romantic references, again, like the warrior in the woods has, but I think it's sort of the same thing, different coat of paint, all that sort of stuff. And the girl does like blush one time, so I don't know. It's not exactly clear whether or not she has romantic feelings for him. I don't think that she does. I think it's just more of a platonic, you know, situation, like especially as she gets older. But yeah, I'm not sure. But I do think that it's the same metaphor as the warrior in the woods in any case. And so the girl says that like she watched him wave his stick and the monsters turned to ash, which is obviously a reference to Ozpin's staff. And that's why I also think that this has to be before the inventor situation, just because like he still has a staff, he doesn't have a cane, you know, and so I'm still thinking of the staff that has that gem on it that he could go like whoosh. The adults think she's lying, but Ozpin tells them not to dismiss what she says and that the girl speaks the truth. And so he hesitates for a moment, and so he's almost thinking like, is it a good idea to say that she speaks the truth? He could have just said like, nah, like I don't know what you're talking about. And so the villagers, they figure it out immediately, and they're like, oh well, he must be a god then, right? And so it's interesting because they mention like, you know, no dust could have done that, you must be a god, right? But they don't consider a high-powered semblance. They don't consider the fact that it could have been a high-powered semblance that did what he did. And they do talk about semblances in aura later, and that Ozpin teaches the people about aura and semblances, the people within his circle. And so you sort of have to wonder, like, whether or not, like, semblance was a very common idea at this time as Ozpin is sort of in this life. Because they immediately jump to him being a god, but later in the story we see, like, anyone with, like, a complex semblance can seem like a god, right? Like a god among men and all that stuff. And so, there's that. I think that's interesting. He says he is trying to be a better man, which again makes me think that this is the life almost immediately after the hermit, or at least a couple lives down. And Ozpin just doesn't seem to have any comprehension of the danger he's in if he tells people the truth about him, right? And this shows, he shows off his magic, even if it means saving people, which is good, but he's also reckless and is putting himself in danger. But he doesn't seem to really care. Because it's like, oh, well, reduce, reuse, recycle, I'm coming back anyway, right? He's not as cautious as we've seen the newer Ozpin iterations become, if that makes sense. And so the village and the girl want to follow him, or what's left over of the village, I should say. A lot of people are dead in that village, but he says he travels alone, and then the girl is like, aren't you lonely and all that stuff? And in his head, he thinks, yeah, I am lonely. And he says that the girl reminded him of his own family that was long gone. And so to me, this is a reference of Salem, right? The daughters, all that stuff, that this little girl reminds him of his kids. And so she, the little girl, throws his words back at him and says that he doesn't need to be alone anymore, and that they can come with him and all this stuff. And then she says, do not be so quick to dismiss the words of the young, especially when they seek the truth. And so you already get this rapport that the girl is sort of taking what Ozpin is teaching her and throwing it back in its face. It's like, hey, you said not to dismiss the words of the young, and me, the young, is telling you that we are coming with you. That's basically how it goes. And so he decides to bring them along for a little while until they can find a new village. But instead, Ozpin basically makes a cult. He basically sort of makes like a religion in a sense, and it's called the Circle, to reference the fact like the circle is complete, doing good deeds for others and receiving good in return, like I already talked about earlier. They rescue more people, and some people, want to learn from the man, some people just want to be safe, and some people wanted to be a part of something bigger. And I feel like that's just sort of a religious undertone thing that's sort of explaining why people like get into religion in the first place. Like some people want to sort of learn, like Jesus's like followers and stuff want to learn from Jesus. Some people want to be a part of something bigger, and that's also like what religion sort of is. And so there's some like religion references to like how we see religion and the value of religion as sort of like community and for safety and for things of that nature as well. And so the girl now turns into a young woman, and she has the idea to call it the Circle. So she says that. And so she's a big part of this, like in organizing all this. And so she says that people need a name to rally around, and he won't tell them his actual name. And so he's like, I've had many names. And again, that references Ozpin's many lives. He says that he never wanted acolytes and that this is dangerous. And I think that that's interesting because he saw, like, this is a reference to what happened with Salem, right? That Salem wanted to become God. And he didn't really like vibe with that, but he was like, oh, okay, because he was still in love with her at that point. Same danger that came from following Salem and from all those people thinking that him and Salem are gods is sort of happening again. But the young woman is sad by this. She's like, acolytes, like, excuse me, like, we're your family, like, I thought we were your friends. And so he says, you are that, but I have made terrible mistakes that hurt both those close to me and strangers alike. Those who follow me are likely to find regret or worse, particularly my family. And so again, this is a reference to what happened with Salem. He's basically saying like, I've hurt people and my kids ended up dying, because of me. The young woman says that it's ironic because that sort of humility and unwillingness to lead is exactly what makes people want to follow him even more, which I think is kind of cute. The girl says, we follow you because we love you and want to learn from you. You are always saying that our future depends on people coming together, and that is exactly what you are accomplishing here. And this again is referencing the task that the god of light gave him, unify the world. And so he says, what we are accomplishing here, you call me your savior when in truth you saved me. The young woman blushes. That's what your teachings are all about. If we can't save ourselves, we have to save one another. Life is a circle, is it not? And again, the blushing, could that be like slight romantic undertones like the warrior in the woods? Yes, but I am not entirely sure. Ozpin says that she is right. She's always throwing his words back in her face, which will be important for later. Ozpin says that they need to teach as many people as possible to defend themselves against the Grimm and the worst things they may face. What could be worse than the Grimm? I hope you never find out. And so again, that's another reference to Salem. And so this man is poisoned. Whoopsies. Ozpin is poisoned by someone in the group, which is a big yikes, and that man is just like, well, I just wanted to see if he would actually die, okay? Don't blame me for poisoning an innocent person. The young woman is like, execute the traitor, and like, Ozpin is like, nah, let him go. I just think it's so funny that she was just like, okay, we're killing him, right? Like, that is some big dick energy. But Ozpin is just like, let him go and tell the others the truth, that I am just a man and not even a very good one, the young woman finishes. And she's like, you told us that your life is a circle and you have lived many other lives before this one, that you have had many names. Does that mean the traitor was right? And then Ozpin's like, I talk too much. And I'm like, yeah, now you're realizing you talk too much. You wanted them to know. And then Ozpin says some nonsense about making our own truths and believing what we want to believe or something. Basically a non-answer. Like, Ozpin, we know that you reincarnate, sweetie. I get it. Right? And so she's just like, if you weren't dying, I would kill you. Right? Because she's just frustrated with this, like, politician answer right there. If everything you've said is true, you must promise to come back to me. Come back to us, she begged. I can't promise that. She stroked his forehead, comforting but also cajoling. All right, but come back anyway. The circle mourned him for 4 days, and this reminds me, Jesus resurrection vibes, right? But rule of fours because it's RWBY. Again, instead of the 3rd day, it's the 4th day, right? Ozpin reveals himself again in a new body, and again, he's not really learning to live with the other lives, is he? He just went into this, like, new man and, like, body snatched him and came back to them, right? Like, he's just like, oh, like, this man's, like, you know, he has his briefcase, he's going into the office one day, and then Ozpin just goes in his head and is like, no, we're not going to work, like, fuck your family, we're going back to the circle, and I'm just like, right? And so obviously, like, Ozpin is not living with his lives yet. That's why I also think that this is before the inventor life. Anyway, he comes back and she seems surprised. So Ozpin is like, what, bro? You didn't believe me? Which is funny because, like, he wanted them not to believe he was immortal so bad earlier, but now he's like, surprised Pikachu face, you don't believe me? Like, as if he wasn't trying to throw them off the scent before. Now the young lady is a middle-aged woman, and so again, we have that fairy tale thing where, like, the more truth is revealed, the older, like, the character gets. Instead of a young woman, she's now middle-aged because she found out, like, the second truth. It's not just Ozpin has magic, it's that Ozpin can reincarnate. That's truth number 2, basically, right? Immortality is revealed, she grows into a middle-aged woman, and it continues. The circle founded its own town, but it also sends out people to bring back new members and stuff like that. It was also renowned as the only place with formal training in defense against the Grim, mastering aura, and unlocking semblance, which again is very cool because we have these townspeople that are like, oh my god, you're a god, right? When they see a little bit of magic, but you would also wonder, like, why wouldn't they think that was semblance? And so, like, there was no formal training for aura and semblance yet. Ozpin was starting to teach them about semblance and stuff like that, I guess. And so, yeah, that was kind of fun. Ozpin is hesitant to stick around, but they insist that they need him, right? They say that his presence will make the group stronger, and he's just like, well, I didn't want to bring people together, so, like, right? And so he says, like, in his head, he says that his efforts were, like, finally working and bearing fruit. Like, this was an accidental experiment, and this is going far better than it has in his other lives. So again, bringing people together, like, this is the best attempt that it's, you know, sort of had. And so that's why I think that even though this is after the hermit life, there have been some other attempts going on. There have been some other lives in between sort of the hermit and the inventor. She says, we trust in you and the fate you've laid out for us. We believe in the good of people and our shared responsibility to protect one another and Remnant. So many have heard our story about you, and now you're here in the flesh. Your presence is living proof that everything you said is true. It reinforces our beliefs and commitment to the circle. Together, now, we will make ready for our final judgment. It would be a mistake for me to stay, he says. And so, again, the final judgment, it's like he taught them that they need to prepare for the final judgment, like, against the gods in a sense. Maybe without saying the gods, but, like, the final judgment thing, like, that's, like, a total reference to the gods, right? And so he's just like, yeah, it would be a mistake for me to say. And so she says, but not your first, and probably not your last. Lead us again. Where else are you needed more than here? Even a man with infinite lives has his limit, she smiled. And he saw the girl he had met years ago in another life. The burden doesn't have to be yours anymore, but think of what we can pass down to the generations that follow. So Ozpin rejoins them. Very convincing message, right? From this girl here. And their reputation and messages spread all throughout Remnant, but then everything goes to shit because of course it does. A group of warriors storm the town and begin attacking the men, women, and children in it. They fought back, but many of them were injured. A female warrior basically comes up and she's like, I want to fight a god. And, like, this is where I literally held my breath and started getting so mad at Ozpin because she wants to fight the man who uses magic and comes back to life. And he says, in my experience, gods are far less than the stories told about them. And again, I wonder if that's like another cheeky reference to the original gods, like the god of light and darkness, or how Salem and Ozma pretended to be gods way before this and the possible stories about them. I really want another fairy tale book so we can get that story and then like the White Witch in the Woods story. He says he is not a god, nor does he want to fight her. You don't have a choice, the warrior said. We always have a choice. We choose to help others instead of hurting them. We can choose how we want to live and how we want to die. The man looked around at the people that had grown close to him, but we must also accept the consequences of our choices. I fucked that dialogue up a little bit, but you guys understand what he's saying, is that the warrior is like, you don't have a choice, and he's like, people, we always have a choice. Like, he's still basically like teaching until the very end, right? And I think that Ozpin is trying to convince her like not to do this shit, but at the same time it's very self-reflective, right? Like, he wanted to make a group to unite people, but with a well-known reputation, it does mean that people are gonna try to come crush you and attack it as well. And like, this is a consequence of his choice of trying to make the group more well-known. And so that's, you know, sort of what he's saying, that we must accept the consequences of our choices. This is a consequence of what he is doing. And then he's also telling his people like, hey, you know, you chose to be here. You chose to be good people, right? You choose how you want to live, and you should choose like the side of good. That's basically, you know, he's trying to tell his people that, but I think it's also self-reflective too, that he, you know, made all these choices. And then this lady is just like, well, fuck off. Okay, here's your choice. You fight me or we will kill everyone here. So he says, if I win, you will leave. The fight is to the death. If you win, my people will take my body and go, the warrior said. And if I lose, we'll take your body and go. And you will leave my people alone, the man asked. You give me your word? And the warrior nodded. And the man said, very well, I accept. And so this is like... this is the bad shit, okay? The fact that Ozpin is so naive that he trusts this warrior woman will leave them alone is infuriating. But I get it, right? Because on, you know, on one hand, these are the lives where Ozpin is just reckless and naive. Like in The Hermit, he was sort of, you know, in this solitude, and he was crabby and, you know, thought the worst of everyone in the world. Now, he thinks the best of everyone in the world. He thinks this warrior woman who is going to kill him has some sort of honor code that she won't like murder all the people that are a part of his town and all that stuff, when that's just not it, you know? And the woman, this is like the middle-aged woman, this is the woman that is working on the circle with Ozpin. She says, no, don't do this. And the man took her hands and said, if I die, it's just a minor inconvenience. If you die, our future dies with you. And this is just where it gets really, really mad. And I don't mean that the writing is stupid, by the way, right? It's just like, I am reading this story and I'm shaking Ozpin's shoulders and I'm like, why did you need to do this, Ozpin, right? Because, like, how could you trust that this warrior woman wouldn't kill your people, bro? Like, how could you just trust her? Because that influences his decision later, if that makes sense. Because, we'll get to that, I guess. But anyway, this lady is able to, like, pull objects towards her or, like, keep her planted or something. It's kind of, I guess, her gravity. Like, she's able to do that to her feet so she doesn't move and stuff. I don't know. But he's like, you know, see, like, powerful aura and semblance can make anyone seem like a god because he can't knock her down at this point. And what's interesting is that Ozpin suspects Salem. At least I think so, because he's like, who sent you to kill me, right? And she says that his mere existence makes him a target. But also, like, that's not a no. You know, she's just like, your mere existence makes you a target, ha ha ha. But she also doesn't say, like, sent me, like, no one sent me, you know? Like, I think that Salem got wind of this and sent her, right? I think that they sent this warrior to kill him, just like she sends people after the Silver-Eyed Warriors. And so what makes me so mad is Ozpin doesn't just fucking blast her, and he's holding back, and he's thinking, like, you know, if I do blast her, the people around me could get hurt or killed. And, like, I just feel like if that was the case, he should have been like, everyone stand back, like, I'm about to, like, do some magic, right? And so he is afraid that basically if he, you know, blasts her into oblivion, like, people will get hurt, right? And so he makes the choice to just let this lady kill him instead of fighting with the full force of his magic. And he made that choice, and it was a choice, and this makes me so mad. And like I like E.C. Myers wants us to be mad, okay? Like, I'm not saying like it makes me mad as in like this is stupid, how could they write this? I'm saying it makes me mad as in they just did such a good job of making you feel like you are being stabbed in the back by Ozpin, even though you're not even involved. You know, like Ozpin doing this, it gutted me. Like, it just makes me heated, right? It absolutely gutted me. And I think that's a sign of like how good this story is. Like, Ozpin's logic, okay? Ozpin's logic does make sense. He doesn't want to go like full blaster mode or he could hurt some of his people, right? And she did give her word that she wouldn't kill the circle, but at the same time, only fucking Ozpin, only Ozpin could be this naive to the new world after being a hermit, right? That he could believe that anyone would keep their word, and that's what makes me want to scream, right? But it makes sense. Like, Ozpin was isolated. You know, first of all, he was a drunk in some of his lives. Then he decides to be the hermit and, like, just isolates himself from the world. Then he re-enters the new world, and he still thinks that there is, you know, chivalry or something. Like, he still thinks that there's honor amongst men. There's no fucking honor, okay? And she slaughters everyone, which is not great, right? And so, yeah, that's what makes me want to scream. And so Ozpin basically dies. He lets her kill him, right? And then Ozpin later in life, another man. Ozpin's on 3 body snatched men today, guys. He finds a very old woman, the same little girl who is missing her left arm and her right eye. She says the circle has been gone a long time and that she is all that's left. They slaughtered every single member of the circle except her. Probably what Salem ordered them to do, an entire genocide of people, right? You know, and that makes me so, because if Ozpin just blasted her, like, sure, a couple people could have died, but you still would have had the circle, and, like, this wouldn't have happened. It wouldn't have been nearly as bad as a genocide of this entire town. And so we get the woman growing up one final time to see the final truth of all, right? Because we've seen a couple truths, that Ozpin can use magic, that Ozpin can reincarnate, and what's the final truth? That Ozpin's a fucking idiot. That's not. But you guys understand what I'm saying? She now grows into an old woman seeing the final truth of all, that Ozpin is, you know, Ozpin just makes me so mad, right? And so she says, why did they destroy us, or why did they leave me to tell the tale? I've spent most of my life turning that question over and over in my mind, and I believe the answer is the same, so that everyone would know the folly of placing their hopes and faith in one man, and not even a very good man. And so, throwing the self-deprecating words back in his face one final time, those words now being true. And then Ozpin says in his head that if she asked who he was, he would not be able to lie to her, but she didn't ask, and that hurt even more. And so here's my theory about this as an ending. Oh, I just got little goosebumps from reading that. She does not have any hope that Ozpin would come back, being too much of a coward to face the fact that he made the mistake and caused the destruction of the circle. That's like one idea, is that she literally has no hope that Ozpin would come back and be able to face her, and so she doesn't even ask whether or not he's Ozpin, right? Or she does know that this life is Ozpin when she sees her, because, you know, how else would somebody recognize the circle? How else would someone know the circle if it's been gone for all these years, right? I think that she could have been able to recognize him right away, and, you know, had a suspicion that this random man asking about the circle when everyone else has long forgotten about it is Ozpin. But she has lost all hope in him. She wants nothing to do with him, and so she just hobbles away. Right? And so she just hobbles away. So those are my 2 theories. She genuinely has no hope Ozpin would come back and does not recognize him as Ozpin, or she does know immediately by the fact that he's asking about the circle that he must be Ozpin, but she just wants nothing to do with him, and so she leaves. Because no explanation that he gives is going to be good enough to justify her witnessing the slaughtering of, like, all of her people and all that stuff. And so, yeah, Ozpin made a mistake. Right? And in Ozpin's notes, he says that many leaders have risen up through Remnant's history as false gods, probably, again, referring to Salem and Ozma, and there are many versions of the story, and it's told in different ways. I think that these versions are told by Ozpin himself. This is my personal headcanon, right? Because, you know, Ozpin says, like, In some stories, he's the hero. In some stories, he's the fool. As some stories, he's the villain, right? And so when you think about that, I feel like that this is him telling the story in self-deprecating ways over the course of history. That in some stories, he like told people that he was a fool. In some stories, he had an inflated sense of self and said, you know what? No, I didn't make a mistake. I was a hero, right? And so that sort of denial, right? So there's one version of the story where he's the hero because he was in denial about it for so long. There's one version of the story where he's the fool because he finally accepted he was the fool. There's one version of the story where he's the villain because he genuinely felt that. He genuinely felt that he was the villain. You know what I mean? And so I feel like that the versions of this different story could be Ozpin retelling it to the members of his inner circle as time goes on. And it's a reflection of how Ozpin sees himself. There's a version of the story where, you know, this man is portrayed as the fool because Ozpin felt at one time he truly was. You guys understand what I'm saying? No, this could also be told by Salem sometimes because he says in certain hands the lesson is about the dangers of following weak leaders, right? And in certain hands sort of reads to me as Salem because Salem teaches Cinder, like, you know, these men, like, they are nothing more than men, right? And that's sort of, you know, that's something that Cinder says. Like, Cinder's like, such arrogance. She told me about you, like, the men that you follow are nothing more than men, right? And so that line reminds me of I'm just a man from this story and not even a very good one. And Cinder is doing that, like, announcement in volume 3. She is saying they are just men and not even very good men, right? And so I feel like that Salem may also be teaching this story to people too. It's interesting because Ozpin sort of, you know, gives us like what lessons are they? Is it not following weak leaders? Is it, you know, not, you know, placing unrealistic expectations on people? And I feel like that the lessons are Ozpin self-reflecting, right? They're the lessons that he sees every time he thinks about this incident. Ozpin wonders if this story could be about weak leaders because he thought that he was a weak leader. Ozpin wonders if it's about being, you know, careful about the expectations you place on people, but Ozpin is the one that placed unrealistic expectations on the circle to survive in his absence and the warrior to stay true to her word. So basically what I'm saying is that Ozpin says, like, he, you know, sees a different lesson in it every time he reads it, and I think that that is a self-reflective way, that he is considering his mistakes every time he reads it, and the more he reads it, the more lessons he's able to derive out of it, right? So he thinks it's about the power of belief and how it can move people to action for good or ill or a mixture. Trust is one of the most powerful forces in the world, and it is not to be abused or dismissed. Yet Ozpin is historically a liar, right? And so yeah, there's that. So Ozpin's like, the truth is the most valuable thing, except I won't tell it. So yeah, there's a bit of a yikes when it comes to that. And so what's interesting too is that he says, like, in some versions, which I've already talked about, he's portrayed as a hero and in others the fool. But Ozpin says that the world does not work in absolutes and that it can be both, right? He can be both a fool and a hero. And I feel like that this, I don't know if this was included for this reason, but this is basically what I've been trying to convince people when it comes to characters like Salem or Ozpin or RWBY or Ironwood. Like, everyone is too obsessed in this fandom with this character did absolutely everything right, like RWBY lying to Ironwood, or this character is a terrible person, they do everything wrong. And none of the RWBY characters are entirely right or entirely wrong. Ironwood can be a hero and a fool, and so can RWBY. The world does not work in absolutes. And so I really like the fact that they included this in the story because it is so important, and it's important for the fandom to learn too, you know what I'm saying? Ozpin goes on to say that in some interpretations, the man represents the villain, which I did briefly mention already, and Ozpin says that good intentions do not always have good results, and I feel like this is probably a preemptive response to the Lost Fable in a sense, like, you know, where we find out Ozpin lied and, like, all his mistakes and stuff like that. Like, I feel like that at the end of the story, he says, you know, we're left to decide whether this man is worthy of forgiveness, and this is sort of a preemptive laying out of, like, if he should or shouldn't. Does that make sense? He's almost asking us, like, it's almost like it's up to you to decide whether this man is worthy of forgiveness, and, like, us knowing everything that Ozpin did, is he? He's almost preemptively asking for forgiveness through this story in a sense, and it's like, okay, but can an entire genocide of people be like, oops, little mistake, forgiven, you know? Like, I feel like that's a big debate, like, whether we can forgive Ozpin for lying and sending people to their death when they don't know the truth about Salem. Like, oh, are those mistakes worth forgiveness, right? And so I feel like that, you know, if Ozpin told this story to the inner circle, right, like, it's almost a preemptive, like, self-deprecating, like, well, it's up to you to decide whether I deserve to be forgiven for those mistakes. And I'm like, but were they really mistakes, though, Ozpin? They were more than little boo-boos, you know what I'm saying? Like, listen, I believe that Ozpin is good. Do not come for me. Like, I know that Ozpin was doing his best, but I'm still gonna die mad about it. That is all I'm saying, right? It's just, I don't know how to explain this, but sometimes when I watch things or read things, like, I get these feelings. It's like a knot in my brain. Like, it's not a knot, like, that's, like, right here, like, at the top of my head, and it's this knot in my brain, and it's like, for example, like, if you've ever watched Atlantis, when I watched Atlantis the first time, I was horrified at the fact that, like, thousands of people, Atlantis the Disney movie, by the way, like, Atlantis, like, how, like, thousands of people die getting to Atlantis, and it's just, like, the 5 of them left, like, after they had this, like, thousands of people, like, expedition, like, thousands of people died in the gravity of that, and so I just, like, inside my brain, I'm wondering, but did those people have to die, though? Or, like, in a less serious example, if you've ever watched The Road to El Dorado, there's this scene where they're steering the boat and they lose literally all the gold. And like that's where I get the knot in my brain where I'm like, did they really need to lose all the gold though? They could have done this and that would have protected the gold. And so like there's this itch, there's this knot inside my brain of like, why couldn't Ozpin just fight her, man? Like, why couldn't he have just killed her? And like, it's really hard to explain, but it's usually like if something tragic happens in a show, I know you guys are like, Cal, the loss of gold is the same as the loss of human life, but you guys understand what I mean. It puts pressure on my brain. It creates this knot of like, right? And so yeah, so that's how I feel about this story. It's very gut-wrenching for me. It's very like, it's very stabby, but yeah. Anyway, I hope that you guys enjoyed this analysis. I hope that you guys have enjoyed all my fairy tale analysis. This is probably the last one. And so yeah, I hope you guys enjoyed. I hope we get a second fairy tale book with those fairy tales I mentioned. But yeah, that is all from me. Hope you guys enjoyed, and I will see you guys in the next one. Bye, guys.